The rationale
Yes,
of
sir.
visual methodology is that with the passage of time, what we call literature has developed a visual turn, especially because many of the literary texts are now available in digital form as well. So the novels which are being written in last 20 years in English, of course, they tend to have visual text in them too. So you might want to look up the novels like Jonathan Foy's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. You know, as you read through the novel, you will find various images emerging throughout the novel. Also, you would see, especially in children literature, a lot of animations being included inside the text. So as you read through the digital text, you will come across the moving figures too. And so this is about the kind of mixed form or mixed media of a literary text. But other than that, uh, in I'm going to use a phrase. It might not be very familiar with you, but I will encourage you to explore it. So there has been an emergence of what we call visual culture, right? This phrase has been used in the chapter though. Now, what is visual culture? Anybody would like to reflect on it? The phrase visual culture. Increasingly, we see the rise in visual culture. What is visual culture? Any thoughts?
Images that are used to present some culture or world.
Okay, all right. Uh, Images, if you put them together, they will kind of appear to be uh, a visual culture. All right. So Tala has written over here, well, visual culture is the aspect of culture expressed through visual images. Okay. All right. So this is one thing that the the aspect of the culture which is represented through images is visual. That is one thing. But our take today with reference to this chapter is little different. It's not just that aspect of culture which is represented through images is visual. Rather, our take is that culture in its totality, overall, the culture in its totality is turning into visual now, right? So you might recall uh, some aspects of culture which were represented through the uh, the act of storytelling. Okay, so you might have heard about those nostalgic uh, pasts of various cultures where people used to sit together, right, in at communal places, at some central place in their communities, and they used to tell stories to each other, right? So the storytelling as a kind of um, act of uh, preserving the culture and then passing it on to the next generation. Many writers have worked on that, especially the writers in Africa, right? Chinua Achebe, you might be aware of this famous, African novelist and writer. So he is of the view that uh, stories are the only place where you can preserve the culture, right? So the storytelling, the narration of the story through words, that has been considered very, very important in preserving a culture and then passing it on to the next generation, right? Now that act of storytelling, which was just the words, uh, words to be listened to, right? Which only had the audio impact, so to say, which only appealed to ears, and through ears one could imagine what those words meant. So that audio, sensory impression of the culture, right? That is increasingly turning into visual sensation now, right? And of course, the major reason for that is the availability of digital technology, right? Because text has gradually changed into visual. Therefore, we are able to translate our cultures in their visual forms, right? So you know the moving pictures, the animations, the paintings. Uh, so somebody was telling me the other day that uh, we don't need art galleries now, right? Because we have Instagram. So whatever utility art galleries had in the past, which is to allow an artist to exhibit their art, right? That utility can be, uh, you know, uh, attained from the Instagram app, right? So all those, infrastructures of art gallery, they suddenly are becoming redundant and irrelevant, right? And the exhibition of art is becoming so cheaper. You just need to have an account on Instagram to display your art. So that is one example of how the preservation of visual culture and its exhibition and its representation has become so convenient because of digital technology, right? So, so this is the rationale for studying visual methodology, or the method to study visuals through through literary studies. Okay. Now, of course, you might still have this question: why to study visuals in in a literature course? Answer to that question is because through literature we necessarily study culture, right? So the example I gave you, that of storytelling, right? Storytelling is so important part of literature, right? So you study short stories, you study novels, even in poetry, not many times you have stories, right? So stories are at the heart of literature, right? And what do those stories do? Those stories actually capture culture, right? So that responsibility of capturing culture is shifting from the audio stories to visual stories, right? And of course, there are other more sophisticated examples of visual culture as well. For example, film and documentary. In other words, cinematography. I'm sure you are aware of the, uh, you know, excessive availability of film and other visual media as well, especially through YouTube, okay, or Vimeo or such other platforms. So individuals can so easily capture their culture in the visual form, you know. through a film or through experimental film. Some people call it uh, avant-garde film, which is more of the art film. They can translate their culture into those, visual films and present them to the world to be watched or to be viewed, right? So these are the reasons for, studying uh, the visuals in literary uh, courses, because the the purpose that literature has, which was to capture and preserve culture, that purpose is now being met through the visual impression rather than the audio impression. Okay, so the writer refers to, in fact, some of the places where these discussions have been taking place. For example, the Journal of Visual Culture and the journal which is called October. This is the title of the journal. So 1996 and 2002, right? So one can have look at these journals just to understand how this visual culture was emerging and replacing the culture of reading. And by the way, now many of the English departments, around the world, they specifically offer uh, positions or jobs with reference to visual culture. So they want those kind of, teachers and instructors and professors who would be equally interested in visual culture. Okay, uh, because uh, because the reader has changed, right? Uh, and the act of reading has changed. And last 2 years especially have been very, very instrumental in kind of accelerating this turn to visual, right? So that is part of the reason why uh, the literature department are more interested in the scholars who can study visuals as well, right? So, for example, in 18th century, 17th century, when uh, novel developed, many of you should be aware of, novelists like Thomas Hardy, Charles Dickens, the whole Victorian era of novel writing. So more reading was available, right? The novels were available to be read. People had time, printing press was there, number of copies could be published, circulated across the countries, and therefore there were more readers to read these novels. Okay, so there was a direct connection between the reader and the text, which was a written text, right? They were very big novels, 400 pages, 500 pages. Thomas Hardy never wrote, less than 200 pages. I think the shortest by him would be 200 pages, right? Under the Greenwood Tree. But the bigger ones were like 700 pages, 600 pages. So, but people read those works, right? And, you know, read read them excessively. Now, that is about 17th century, 18th century, and 19th century, of course. And then short story emerged as a form and became more popular because it was shorter and people could read in the less time, right? So kind of there is a direct correlation between the nature of the reader and the availability of the text, right? Now, more recently, as I already said, visuals are becoming more popular, right? So what is available more in terms of viewing or watching or reading or observing, in the realm of text, uh, will determine the reader as well. Okay, so you currently we have more viewers and watchers rather than the readers, right? So you have easy access to Netflix and YouTube and all other platforms of this kind. Um, even the social media sites, they run on the basis of images. Okay, so the reader therefore has changed now, and because the reader is more in connection with screen rather than written book, therefore literature needs to engage with a kind of methodology that can help the new reader to interpret what is on the screen. All right. So this is kind of background to the visual culture or the visual method that we need in order to understand the visual culture. So if you are with me and you can see the screen, uh, let's review some parts of this chapter. So, for example, here, Rose Gillian Rose would say the resolute attention paid by cultural studies to popular culture in all its diverse forms, including film, television, graphic books, right, advertising, comics, and so on, has considerably broadened the kinds of visual imagery now considered acceptable for academic study, right? So look at the range, okay? Uh, but then this is an old book, right? This is not a recent book. It's like 30 years ago that we are talking about. And I'm sure you will agree that all these things have become even more prevalent, in our current times. Okay, so allow me to read from, starting from here. So images and written or spoken words seem to live in an intimate relation. But by and large, the critical apparatuses brought to bear upon them appear either intent on keeping them apart or on seeing one as subsidiary to the other. There seems to be a general reluctance to discuss the ways in which meaning cannot be self-evidently read off these images. English studies rarely pays attention to the imagery that accompanies the written text, and while the way in which visual images are scrutinized for their meaning very often depends on the broader contextual accounts that rely on a wide and scholarly reading of contemporary texts of many kinds. It is still unusual to find a detailed concern with the text, found in close actual proximity to the image in question, right? So, um, so this reluctance is, maybe your generation may not be aware of that reluctance much, but for a certain generation, uh, many people will bear witness to the fact that readers have always been reluctant to take into account the accompanying images in any literature text. So because the scholars, they have been too much biased to the written word. The scholars in English studies, they have been biased in favor of the written word. So what is written, is always privileged over any accompanying painting or picture or image. Okay, so part of the effort in learning visual methodologies is to recognize that images and painting are valid texts. They are also texts, right? Even they are not in written form, yet they have their own meaning. So it is important to overcome that reluctance, to take a text seriously. So examples are, examples of their reluctance. These are very nice examples over here. Uh, I mean, this is other way around as well, right? So people who, for example, visit museum, or those who watch film, right? Whose favorite, medium to observe the culture is film, they would be more engaged with the visual impact and will ignore the accompanying text, right? So this habit is both ways. So those who are trained in visuals and images, they tend to ignore the accompanying text, right? So for example, how many of us, when we watch a film, actually read, you know, uh, all the credits, right? Probably none of us, okay? Uh, because the impression that we have when we are watching a film or when we are watching, painting, the impression that we have is that it is the painting which is meant to be watched, or it is the film which is meant to be watched, right? So watching a film or viewing a painting almost automatically means that we don't need to read anything, you know. Uh, it- so both of those media seem to be meant to be watched only. So we purposefully ignore anything which is written along a painting, right? For example, a caption, or anything which is written along a film. For example, any credits which go along with it. Okay, so these habits are both ways, So the literature people would avoid any accompanying visual as irrelevant, and the visual people, the people who study art and culture or film, they would ignore, the written text. Okay. However, Gillian Rose over here is proposing, a new approach which should be able to take into account both the text and the visual, right? So the expression she uses for that is called compositional interpretation, right? So as in routine we are aware of and we practice interpretation, right? I hope most of you are aware of the expression, and most of you are also aware of the fact that in literary studies as well as in cultural studies, the most important act of conducting research is interpretation. So that is what mostly the scholars in English studies, or the scholars in literary studies, or the scholars in cultural studies do. What do? They interpret the texts. Okay. And in order to, undertake that interpretation, they use some of semiology and some of discourse analysis, right? But Gillian is kind of, putting them together, and she is calling them compositional interpretation, right? So compositional interpretation will be a method which simultaneously uh, takes into account both the visual and the written text. So as she would further say over here, I have chosen to discuss semiology and discourse analysis as two useful methods for approaching visual imagery with a further consideration in mind, that is to encourage a critical approach to visual imagery. Images are important, it seems to me, not simply because for some people in some places they are pervasive, because they have effects. In particular, they have effects in relation to the construction of social differentiation. Different identities, different subject positions are reiterated in highly complex ways by visual images. And such differences are driven by power relations. Pfeiffer and Law's comments remain as opposite now as they were when they wrote them. Okay. You don't need to read this example, but the point that Gillian is making over here is that visual images need to be read and need to be approached and discussed, because they have very strong effect in human society. in our society. She is taking one example, she's giving us one example of that. The visual images generate social differentiation. So, at the face of it, images will just continue to appear and disappear. We will watch them, and then probably for some time we will watch one set of images, and then we'll probably pass on to the next set of images. And this practice goes on and on, right? But Gillian would argue that once we have seen an image, even if we pass on to the next set of images, the images continue to maintain their effect on our perspectives and on the way we look at the world, right? Now, the example of power relation or social differentiation is the one which is more common to our society. For example, I can put this example in two ways. One is that in lot many visual images that we will come across with reference to some of the South Asian cultures is that uh, is the way the gender is represented through visual images, right? So, for example, women will be represented, uh, with a certain dress code. Let me put it like that. And that dress code will be so different from the dress code of men. Now, as we live the real life, of course, we all follow the cultural and the social and the maybe religious, uh, you know, mannerism in order to dress in a particular way, right? Which is fine, of course, because that is how societies move in a smooth manner. However, when uh, when a certain gender is represented with a certain dress code repetitively over and over again through various visual representations like film, drama, painting, advertisement, when a certain gender is represented over and over again through one particular dress code, okay, say for example, uh, a veil, right? Or any other dress code that you can possibly think of. That representation of a certain gender with a particular dress code is not an innocent representation, right? Why is that not innocent representation? It is not an innocent representation because it is highly political act to present a gender in a particular dress code repetitively, right? Because the images have impact, they have effect on the viewer. So if you are constantly exposed to one particular dress code with reference to any particular gender, we as audience and viewers will be conditioned to see that gender only with reference to that particular dress code, and we will start feeling that this is the natural dress code for that particular gender. Not only that is natural, but that is the only normal dress code. So that dress code for that particular gender will become what we call a normative dress code. Is that right or wrong? We don't know, but it is highly problematic. Why? Because no gender dress code can be a universal dress code, right? So depending upon a culture, dress codes continue to change. Depending upon the historical movement, so the dress codes that women had 4,000 years ago were so different from dress codes of today, right? But when we necessitate in visual images a particular dress code, you know, that conditions us, the viewers, to view that gender with reference to just that particular dress code. Okay, so well, if the generators and the creators of the visuals, if they are given a freedom to choose a dress code for a particular gender in in particular visuals, then probably there is not much issue. But it becomes problematic when the creators of the visuals are required to, always portray a certain gender in a particular dress code. That becomes problematic then. Why? Because then visuals become a means for a propaganda, right? Uh, so I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with any particular representation, right? It could be representation in the West, in England, in United States, in Europe, wherever. It can be anywhere in the world. It is equally problematic everywhere, right? It is problematic everywhere if it is necessitated, if it is kind of made a requirement that a certain gender must be, represented just through a particular dress code. So when it is made kind of something essential, then it becomes problematic. That is one example. The other example I want to give, it is again with reference to gender. Uh, it is, the representation of uh, members of one particular gender in social spaces as opposed to domestic spaces, right? So, for example, I was looking at a at a picture of. By the way, pictures are also part of visual culture, right? Uh, so I was looking at a picture of a conference that took place in Lahore just a few days ago. That was a picture of the concluding ceremony of the conference. So that was like a substantial group of people, maybe 20 people, 20 individuals were there, 18 to 20. That was a group photo. So the one of the things I immediately observed in the picture was that among all those individuals, there appeared to be just one woman, and rest of them were men, like say 19, right? Of course, there's nothing wrong in that. It's absolutely fine, right? Those are the people who worked for the conference, and so we had the conference. But what is problematic is the representation of the gender balance. So clearly, the gender balance is tilted in favor of the male because the male seem to be dominating the image. The men seem to be dominating the image, right? So Gillian calls it, if you look at this phrase again, the construction of social differentiation. So a certain social differentiation is being propagated, right? It is being advanced through an image of this kind that I just talked to you about, where over and over again you see the pictures of social gatherings, right? So this was a social gathering, the example that I gave you. It could be, social gathering uh, in informal way or in informal way, either way. but you see that how the gender balance is kind of, uh, biased, right? And a social differentiation is created. I hope you understand the idea of social differentiation. Uh, we everything that we understand it because of differentiation, right? So, for example, we understand black because it is different from white. That is how human mind works, right? So, right is recognized because we know what is wrong. This is called differentiation. So, all meaning making activity takes place through differentiation, right? Now, um, this differentiation is constructed through visuals. Now, in the case of the picture where you see uh, one woman and 19 men in one picture, again, a social differentiation has been created over there as well. But this is a kind of social differentiation where one group has been privileged over the other, right? So this is the role that visuals play. They kind of impact our mind. So we start taking it just but natural that okay, whenever such formal activities take place, we start expecting to see a very insignificant portion of population being women and a significant portion of the organizers being men, right? So this is just one example of how these visuals impact the way we look at the world, right? So a painting of this kind is generating a world view for those who are looking at that painting over and over again, right? So now imagine if you're exposed to thousands of such pictures and painting on daily basis, right? From Facebook, from Instagram, from newspaper, from advertisement, from TV, you watch lot many news items, and if you are over and over exposed to the similar kind of visual representation of male female uh, imbalance, then we will start expecting that kind of imbalance as something but natural, right? So that is why I said that these visual representations are not innocent, right? Rather they have a political meaning as well, right? They have a politics of gender behind that, right? Any questions so far?
No, sir.
All right. So we are at compositional interpretation. So this is the method that Glian proposes to interpret a painting or an advertisement or film, or any other visual representation that we come across, right? So let's read these 2 to 3 paragraphs over here to just get to know some of the basics of what she calls compositional interpretation, right? So you are aware of the word interpretation. That should not be new for you all. The word interpretation, I mean, that is what supposedly you should have been doing in English literature through the courses you have been taking. It is a kind of analysis, it is the kind of meaning that you assign to a particular text, especially if you have taken a course in the basic introduction to literature course. So I always teach my students interpretation of any given literary text, because that is eventually that we all students of literature and teachers of literature, that is what we always do, right? But this is compositional interpretation. So this is not just interpretation, but compositional interpretation, right? So we need to kind of crack open this word compositional over here, because that is something new, right? And different from interpretation. So Gillian would say that this is a term I have coined for a way of proceeding in relation to images that is particularly common in art history, right? So this is natural. right? So the methods in literary studies, almost all of them come from other disciplines, and it is very common in in humanities and social sciences. Uh, so in oral history, for example, we discussed how many of the methodological uh, principles, they were coming from the field of history itself, right? Similarly, over here in the compositional interpretation, the method comes from art history. Art history is an independent discipline as well, right? But we are talking about literary studies right now and visual methodologies within literary studies. So compositional interpretation is a method that offers a way of looking very carefully at the content and form of images, right? And these two are different things, content and form, right? In my experience as an outsider to art history, it is a method that seems second nature to all art historians. That is, all art historians practice it. What distinguishes between the different kinds of art history eventually produced is what is then done with the evidence thus constructed. All art historians, though, are trained to scrutinize the image itself very carefully to produce what one might describe as a close reading of the image. So you should immediately see one major difference between interpretation and compositional interpretation, right? So what as students of literature you have been doing is just the interpretation, which was the close reading of a text, of a written text. But when it comes to compositional interpretation, it is not close reading of a written text, rather it is close reading of the image, right? So that is a primary difference that you should mark for yourself, and you should get prepared now to closely read an image rather than a written text. Exactly what this entails is not very often made explicit, and in fact, although I'm going to offer some guidelines that do make composition interpretation explicit method, I will also suggest that there is a certain element of intuition, a certain sensibility implicit in this approach. For those not trained in art history, though, making this procedure a little more transparent is necessary, not least because the successful deployment of the other method discussed in the chapter, methods that I think are more appropriate for a critical visual methodology, also relies initially on detailed scrutiny of the image itself, right? So you should mark this phrase, critical visual methodology, right? So so the chapter is named as visual methodology, but remember that essentially visual methodology means the critical visual methodology. All right, now we come to the term composition. What do we mean by the word composition in compositional interpretation, right? Anybody would like to say or comment on the word composition? How do you take the word composition? You have been studying composition at any stage in past? What do we mean by the word composition over here? So Gillian is saying that compositional interpretation is a method that we can use to analyze an image. So what do you get from the word composition over here? This is my question to you all. Hello students, are you there? What are your comments or thoughts? Okay, Kshmala says a creative work is composition. Okay, very good. Yeah, yes. So generally speaking, we say we compose a poem. Do you get the point? We compose a poem, right? Uh, we tend to relate the word compose or composition just with the writing process, right? But that should not be like that, right? So the word composition should be, uh, you know, expanded to include all kinds of compositions. So composition of an image as well as composition of an essay or a composition of a poem or composition. Yeah, somebody nicely put over here composition of any music. Yes, very good. Yeah, this is a very good example. Kuratulan composing music, right? Um, and then Faiza says the way something has been structured. Okay, good. Yeah, that I think that also is important to understand that composition, all compositions are structures, right? Even if they are abstract, uh, in some cases they are not abstract though, yet, yes, it is structuring something. All right. So composition, as Gillian will put over here, and you should be able to see on your screen, refers to the structure of an image, how all its elements combine together, which might or might not make some sort of whole. And although the aim of compositional interpretation is indeed to describe the image as attentively and as fully as possible, the notion of composition can nonetheless be broken down into a number of component parts. And she refers to Taylor and Acton, the other scholars from whom she is taking help to explain what is, compositional interpretation. So the first thing, as I said, above, that content and form, these are two important elements of any image, right? So she would begin with that, the content of an image. So when we start analyzing an image, the first thing we need to notice in that is what is its content. So this may be very obvious for some images, but less so for others, particularly those made in periods when certain kinds of symbolism were routinely deployed to make meaning through images. Then there are the colors of an image. The colors themselves can be described in terms of their hue, the color itself, its saturation, right? How intense a version of that color it is, and its value, right? How light or dark it is. But there is also the question of how these colors work together. Are they harmonious or not? What is highlighted by the use of what color? Are connections made between certain parts of an image by the repeated use of one color? Do certain colors mean something? How does the light in the image play into this? What is the light source? What kind of light is it? What effects does it have? Right? So these all are questions of the content of an image. So these questions merge into another set of questions about how the image is organized internally. Does it have figures and a background? Where are its volumes and do they balance or not? What movement or rhythm is there in the image between its volumes? Is there depth indicated by some kind of perspective, or is there flatness? Importantly, this internal organization of an image often offers a particular viewing position to its spectator. So how does the image position you? Are you expected or invited to occupy a certain location in order to see it? Or does it baffle your look, dispersing you across its surface? Finally, and this is the moment where something more intuitive happens, what is the overall effect that these various elements produce? This is an invitation to describe the feel or the tone of an image, to say something about its particular quality, to evoke its character. So then to conclude about this method, composition interpretation thus offers a series of questions that should lead to the careful description of the content, color, spatial organization, light, and expressive content of a still image. So when you comment on the content of the image, you comment on its color, its spatial organization, the light, and expressive content of a still image. This is very useful as a first stage of getting to grips with an image. And it's concerned for the spatial organization of an image. Moreover, composition interpretation may also begin to say something about an image's possible effects on a spectator. And I suggest that this is particularly important for methodologies concerned with imagery's effect. However, as a method for developing a critical account of a visual image, compositional interpretation on its own has various shortcomings. So one of the limitations is its resolute descriptiveness. It focuses almost entirely on the image itself and is therefore highly formalist in its approach. It thus has nothing to say about the interrelations between an image and its companion writing. And I opened this chapter by arguing precisely for the importance of those interrelations. Right? It has little means to address how an image might be used and interpreted by specific viewers. Because of this unproblematized concern for visual images as they are, compositional interpretation needs to be combined with other methodologies. And then she goes on to describe other methodologies as well. Uh, Together, they are called semiology and discourse analysis, right? So she is not going to leave us to what art historians are already doing, which is interpreting a visual image. Rather, she is now going to take us into the realm or into the area where we analyze a given text. Sorry, we analyze a given image with reference to the accompanying text, right? Now we need to remember that it is because of the accompanying text, a text that accompanies an image, or let's put it another way, it is because of the accompanying image, that is an image which is presented along with the text. It is because of their coexistence, the coexistence of the written text and the visual text. It is because of that the students of literature need to study the visual culture. And that is why the study of visual culture becomes relevant for English literary studies. Okay, so we will continue our discussion on semiology and discourse analysis, and we finish that